But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where today we'll be diving deep into the strategic world of Otto von Bismarck. Known as the Iron Chancellor, Bismarck was a master statesman whose deft political maneuvering and visionary leadership were instrumental in unifying Germany and shaping European politics in the late 19th century. In today's episode, we look at his rise to power and his unique approach to governance. We delve into his Realpolitik, a pragmatic and tactical approach to his politics and diplomacy. This episode will examine how his policies, including the famous Blood and Iron speech, laid the foundation for the German Empire and dramatically altered the European balance of power. We'll learn about the complexity of Bismarck's alliances and his skill in avoiding wars, yet paradoxically setting the stage for future conflicts. Today we'll analyze his domestic policies, including the pioneering social welfare system and his attempts to quell socialist and liberal opposition. Join us today as we unravel the legacy of Otto von Bismarck and discover how his strategic foresight and political acumen left an indelible mark on Germany and the world, echoing through the annals of history.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we are going to continue in Germany. And we kind of talked about it last week, where we kept saying, hey, there's all these great other people that we can talk about that kind of are tangential to Wilhelm. And we talk a lot about Otto von Bismarck and their relationship. And we really kind of came away from that episode. And it was pretty quickly after we were like, yeah, he deserves his own episode. And we're already kind of in the midst of German history here. Why don't we just do Otto von Bismarck? So Otto von Bismarck is the man of the day, and he's got this reputation that's really the polar opposite of Wilhelm, where Wilhelm is bringing Germany to the brink of defeat and full defeat in World War I, and really undoing a lot of the great work that Bismarck did to not only make Germany a strong nation, but to even create it as a nation altogether, which was something that he and people around him didn't even think was possible in their lifetimes. And they were able to do it and then solidify it. Just to kind of have it be broken down by Wilhelm is a bit of a peak in a valley, but that's kind of the way things go sometimes. So I think, like we were talking about last week, Ritchie, he definitely deserves his own episode. And I think this will be a really interesting compare and contrast, not just to him and Wilhelm, but to other great unifiers and leaders and nation builders that we've studied throughout the series of this podcast.
Yeah, totally. Couldn't agree more. And I think for our listeners, something to probably keep in mind and worth calling out is that if you're listening to the Wilhelm episode first, which would make sense chronologically in terms of how we've released the episodes, what we're going to be talking about today kind of precedes Wilhelm. So it's Otto von Bismarck and then Wilhelm. But you never know where these kind of conversations can go. And this is often how we find ourselves talking about other historical figures. But I think just to compare and contrast as we were doing our research and, just talking offline, it's a great comparison and study and comparative analysis between leadership styles, foresight, strategic decision making. I thoroughly enjoyed doing research for this one, more than I thought I would. And yeah, I'm pretty excited to get into it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a pretty interesting one. And like you said, I think the thing we enjoy the most about this is we start talking about one person and then this other person starts showing up and we start to go, hey, who's this person? We start to look into it and they have their own story that's super interesting. And I think when we look at where the world goes after Bismarck's kind of off the scene is lots of war, lots of reshaping of Europe, and really creating this modern world that we see today. And it really comes back to a lot of the work Bismarck did. But I think to kind of give a little bit of a backstory here, we're going to do a little bit of the history up to the point of German unification and how Germany becomes the country that we know today. However, we did go into Prussia and the history of Germany a little bit last week. So we're not going to go as deep today. We're going to give a quick overview of what Prussia was and then kind of move on to the German Empire and the German state as it would change over the last 200 years. So just real quickly on Prussia, the question always comes up is, well, what the heck is Prussia? It's not Russia, it's Prussia. It's its own thing. And it's this kingdom that was around in a duchy for a while, that was around for about 500-600 years, starting kind of after the Crusades. And one of the key things with this is it's really when you think about Germany and you think of all the stereotypes of Germany, of this kind of hard and cold and efficient and strong military and all that kind of stuff. This all comes out of Prussia. So throughout this time, there's a lot of Germanic peoples, German-speaking peoples, but Prussia's kind of the main brunt of that. And then you have other kind of kingdoms and little city-states such as like Bavaria, and you have all these other places who are kind of all within the mix, and they all kind of become part of the Holy Roman Empire at some point. But really, Germany as a proper nation is not necessarily something that's even conceived at this point. There might be some commonalities between, hey, we're all German speaking, we have something in common. But then again, it's the way I almost like to look at it is like, think of the United States today. You have, you're trying to make them a country, for example. You have people who are from Texas versus people from Minnesota. They speak the same language. The religion is the same. They have some of the same values, but from a core, maybe cultural perspective, there are some pretty large differences. And to be able to unify those types of people when they're not already unified would be a bit of a challenge. So I think that's kind of a good way to think about where Germany is heading to at this point. But Prussia really is this key force in all of this. And they have an incredibly strong military and an incredibly strong military tradition, which we talked about last week, where Wilhelm was pushed into this strong military tradition and it didn't really rub off on him in the way that people were hoping. And that's kind of what gives Prussia this power in Europe. And, you know, they become one of the big players alongside the French, the Austrians, the English, the Russians, and the Italians. So they're not just, you know, some small kingdom on the outskirts. They are the core piece of really what's becoming in Central Europe and really for the rest of time when we look at Europe.
Yeah, I think just a couple of things that came to mind, Paul, while you were speaking. You know, this is really, you know, it's funny when you're like knee deep in the research and I'm trying to do like the bio of Bismarck, you kind of lose sight, you know, you lose the forest for the trees, as the saying goes. And just to bring it up a level, just even personally and for our listeners, this is very much an episode, at least maybe with lower level detail, about this, like the project of nation making. This is what Bismarck is doing. This is kind of his goal, this kind of unification effort. And I think what we'll see and learn about him is that, you know, there's probably no larger or more complicated project that someone could take on, which is to create an entire nation and unify it and be able to rule it cohesively. And, you know, he was able to do that. And I think there's a lot of cool lessons learned about what it kind of takes from a leadership perspective to be able to actually do such a thing successfully.
Yeah. And if I look kind of at what it means to be, you know, a great Prussian leader, there's this sense of duty and responsibility. There's a push towards education and really kind of getting into that intellectualism when it comes from a philosophical perspective as well, and a scientific perspective. It's not just military. There's an actual culture being built around this. There's an economy being built around this. So for someone like Bismarck to come into a situation like this, he needs to be able to straddle all three of those pillars when it comes from industry, from when it comes from the military, and when it comes from what we would see as more as the liberal kind of side of things on the philosophical and the scientific side and the arts scene as well.
Yep.
There's all these factors that need to come together to build a great nation. But then if we look at where Prussia is sitting and even where Germany is sitting today, to the west, you have the French, to the east, you have the Russians, to the north, you have the English, and then you also have the Spanish and the Ottomans and all of these other great empires that are kind of maybe more on the outskirts, but definitely have a key effect on everything that's going on. So it's not like Germany's kind of sitting off to the side and they can kind of handle their own affairs without having to deal with everybody else. They're right in the middle of Europe. And if Russia wants to declare war on France, where do you think they're marching right through? So this is not just there's a lot of foreign policy and international relations that need to be done outside of just, you know, it's hard enough to get your domestic policy under control, but now you got to make sure that what you're doing doesn't upset the English so they invade or blockade you, or the Russians decide to invade because maybe they see an opportunity to gain some territory. It's a little bit more of a craft more than a skill, I think, at this point. There's a lot of fine touch that needs to be done, and there's a lot that can go wrong really, really quickly. So it'll be interesting, I think, as we go along today, if we can start to pick out some of those things that Bismarck has that, you know, we could say, yeah, he pushed things just as far enough as he needed to, and he stopped, and he knew if he went a little bit farther, or he just ignored something, or he went pedal to the metal on something, because it's all about that fine balance and when to kind of open the valve and go full speed versus kind of sitting back, waiting, letting the chips fall, and then making a decision from there.
I think you said it quite well, Paul. I think what we'll probably walk away with is that ability to kind of toe that line really, really well. Definitely not a science. It's much more of an art. And I think, he was quite masterful in actually doing this, to be successful.
Definitely. So I think before we maybe jump into his life, we need to give a little bit of an overview too on these Germanic/German states that are existing. So again, it all goes back to Napoleon because everything goes back to Napoleon. So after the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon defeated the Holy Roman Empire. The empire kind of split apart, and after Napoleon was defeated, there was little appetite to try and recreate it. There was a lot of German states that were created as a result of Napoleon's invasion of the Holy Roman Empire, and he started to give them some autonomy themselves to kind of gain alliances with them. And it was something that they kind of liked, and they didn't really want to see it all come back together. And think about having an empire be torn apart that's not necessarily unified by one nationality or one religion in the same way you might see like a France or a Spain, and try to stitch it all back together after there's been a lot of work to kind of fracture it out and kind of use it for Napoleon's own good. So there wasn't a lot of, appetite to kind of bring it all together. And really that kind of happened through a process called German mediatization, which looked to secularize the former states of the Holy Roman Empire. And this is really in line with what we've been seeing across Europe, and especially in France, where the church is losing a lot of power. There's a lot of people asking questions, especially in the French Revolution, of why does the church have so much power? The power should belong with the people, or should belong with the parliament. And so now Germany's losing its religiosity, I would say, in a little bit of a sense from a power perspective. The clergy isn't that powerful force anymore. And so as that's starting to get transferred to the state, that unifying factor of religion starts to go away, which makes things a little bit more tricky when you want to stick it all back together and name it the Holy Roman Empire. So that religious element's kind of gone. And then by the time that's all done, there was about 300 German states, and they had consolidated them into about 39. So you may just have like one small kingdom that gets kind of amalgamated into something else. And then that leader becomes a lord or a duke of some part of that state and is able to, gain a lot of wealth and have some power in that new state. But they've broken it down to 39, which if you look at the size of Germany, it's not a huge place. Mm-hmm. And if to kind of break it up into 39 little pieces and then try to glue it all together is going to be really, really tricky. So we're at this point where you have all these states, Napoleon's defeated, and they kind of create this German confederation, which really is a loose agreement that they had for mutual defense. So one of these 39 states gets invaded, the rest would come and defend it as defending your German brothers in this sense. And really part of that is Prussia takes a huge, huge role in that. And one thing that happens that's really, really key is the Prussians take control of the Rhineland. So the Rhineland is the land that's just east of the Rhine River, which just separates Germany and France. And so this area had actually belonged to the Austrians, but there was a lot of things going on with the Dutch and the Belgians where every time there was some civil unrest, the Austrians would have to send troops in, and they were like, you know what, we're so sick of dealing with it. Prussians, you guys take it. So if you ever look at a map of Prussia, it's always really strange because you'll see kind of a big chunk of it in like the northeast of Germany. And then you kind of see like little parts scattered around the rest of the country. And so you might be asking like, why the heck is that? And that's part of it, is they take control of this land after Napoleon's defeated. But the one thing with the Rhineland is it's very, very rich in resources. There's already booming industries going along there. And now you bring in this Prussian kind of stereotypical German side of industry, efficiency, all of those sort of things. And now Prussia is gaining a lot of power. They're creating arms. They're creating these new economies and getting very, very rich and powerful as a result. So, after Napoleon's defeated, I'm sure people weren't thinking too much about Prussia becoming so powerful. They were more thinking of how do we just get back to the status quo and keep things normal? And Austria's like, we don't want to deal with this Rhineland. But this is a key point that really puts Prussia maybe now into this upper tier of European states that gets the attention of the rest of Europe.
I think it just goes to show like the complexities of this particular era, right? Like the modern world is forming around these various European states, and it's kind of a clamoring of who's going to be responsible and owning of what boundaries and borders. And I think this is probably, and I've said it countless times, like this particular section of history can be very difficult to kind of grasp because borders and alliances change, on a daily, weekly, monthly basis if you're lucky. And I think to like really be able to pin down and unify and kind of be able to galvanize a group of people at this time is really quite remarkable.
Yeah, because I think we run into that, we look at a map today and we're like, oh, there's Germany, and all the people within those lines are German, but ask Hitler what his thoughts were on who was actually German, who wasn't German, and his view was very different than I'm sure what Bismarck would have said and what people today would have said. So it's a very different kind of look over that world. And it's not, the lines don't necessarily represent what, people back then would be thinking, and it would be very different. And then you also have, like you were saying, alliances are changing, but also people have their own goals and motives towards what's going on.
Always, yeah.
Yeah. So it's not like everyone's like, oh, great, we're all German. Let's all get together and high five and become a country. Everybody's trying to figure out how they're going to benefit from this. And if they're not, they're probably not going to have, too much interest in it. So, we're in this kind of 1820s, 1830s era, and this German Confederacy it's hanging around. It's doing its thing. It's not really a proper country. Like I said, it's a loose alliance. It's not really something that people would say is unified in any stretch of the imagination. But really what happens at this point is there's just a lot of like bureaucratic things that are happening. Things are changing. They're passing laws to do certain things. There's a war between Austria and Prussia. And after the war, the Confederacy is dissolved and replaced with the North German Confederation, which again is just another really uninteresting thing that kind of happens where these states are shifting around and kind of going through the history. It just, everything kind of shifts around, and then Bismarck shows up and bang, it becomes a country, which is a way too simplified way of putting it. But at this point, it's important to kind of understand that just we get to Napoleon, he's defeated. You have all of these states who are like, there's probably something here that we could unify. And it just takes a lot of time to get through that process. And it's a really, really slow burn. And it does take a great leader to do that. And I think, as we'll see today, Bismarck ends up being that person. But to really just take away from this is it's very, very fractured. Nobody really knows who belongs with what. It easily could have split into two countries, into three countries, but the fact that it's one is very, very interesting. And I think we'll come to see why Bismarck's kind of skill from a domestic, international diplomacy perspective will be a key reason why this ends up working out well for Germany.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that's a great segue for us to kind of start talking about Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. And I'll regale us with a story about why he is the Iron Chancellor a little bit later. So a little bit of a teaser here. I didn't know there was a story behind it, but there are some accolades that probably not here in your average history class, but we're not your average history class, so we can get into it now. But so essentially, I always think it's a good place to start off when we start talking about the bio, about someone's early life and kind of where they're born and the family they came up in, because I think it provides a lot of great insights into kind of creating and crafting the person they're going to become. So Otto von Bismarck, he's born on April 1st, 1815 in Schönhausen. He's born to a noble estate in the Kingdom of Prussia. So he comes from a family of younger nobility. His father, Karl Wilhelm Ferdinand von Bismarck, was a landowner and a former Prussian military officer. His mother, Wilhelmine Louise Mencken, came from a family of academics and government officials. And I think this blend of military and bureaucratic backgrounds in his family definitely influenced his upbringing significantly. And Paul, I think you kind of foreshadowed it earlier, which was to kind of talk about kind of the formation and unification of Germany and this kind of sophistication and balance between this very, steadfast and hardy military tradition, while also balancing some of the more social and intellectual kind of pursuits that also, provided the progressive success that Prussia and Germany had. And I think, Bismarck's kind of a archetype of this in many ways. Maybe we can just to call out. So I use the term younger nobility. So this refers to members of the landed nobility in Prussia and Eastern Germany who owned large estates. Again, going back to like serfdom, these estates are typically managed by serfs or peasant labor, and they're a significant part of the feudal system in the region. The term younger actually comes from a Middle High German word called Junker, meaning young lord. So if we look at his mom and dad, his dad was a traditional Prussian Junker. He came from a long line of landowning aristocrats with a history of military service. He himself served as a lieutenant in the Prussian army. He was very typical of most Prussian landed gentry. He managed the family's estates and was deeply rooted in conservative agrarian military traditions of his class. His lifestyle and values kind of embodied this traditional rural aristocratic elements of Prussian society, which, ultimately as we will see, influenced Bismarck's conservative outlook and appreciation for land ownership and the military. His mother, in contrast, came from a more intellectual and bureaucratic background. She was the daughter of a senior government official and had been exposed to the intellectual and cultural life of Berlin. Her family was a part of the educated upper middle class bureaucracy that formed a significant part of Prussian society. This background, exposed her to different ideas and values than those of the traditional younger class, and her influence on Bismarck was substantial, particularly in ensuring that he received a good education and was exposed to kind of broader cultural and intellectual currents of the time.
It's that balance again, right? We talked about it earlier, and we've seen this a lot with a lot of different leaders that we've looked at. Having that mix from a parental standpoint really seems to kind of jumpstart something for a lot of these leaders where they're not just given, top education, that kind of stuff. They're exposed to different ways of thinking. And I think when you're going to be a unifier of a country, you need to be able to put yourself in the shoes of a variety of different types of people. But one other thing that you kind of mentioned that's jumped out to me as well is I kind of get into the trap when I think of the 1800s and I start thinking of industrial revolution and people moving into cities is how much farming is still the main thing that most people do to make a living. And, peasant farmers and serfdom is still running rampant across Europe and the world. So when we kind of talked about last week about Bismarck and his more conservative thoughts around workers and workers' rights and that sort of stuff, I can kind of see where he's coming from because he is born into a world where you talked about it, like you're a lord and you're a lord over these people who work the fields and that's kind of what they do as peasants for the majority or all of their life. So yeah, it's an interesting one. I think that just made me kind of have a new perspective a little bit on this time frame because we talk about, Germany and industrialization and all these sort of things, and they're really pushing the envelope. But, the vast majority of people who are he's going to have to get on his side to be able to actually unify this country, aren't the people who are, maybe necessarily working in factories or working on docks and that kind of stuff. They're working the fields like they have for the last, 500,000 years or something like that.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Paul. I think the marriage of his parents is somewhat representative of it's kind of like a merging of two different strata of society. You have the traditional landowning aristocracy and the educated bureaucratic class. And I think this convergence essentially is what provided him that very unique perspective. So he's able to understand and appreciate both conservative rural traditions, but he also sees the value in having some progressive and intellectual, pathways to kind of think more broadly. And we will see aspects of this in some of his more social welfare in terms of some of the policies he actually did push through, which actually were quite shocking to me in terms of how conservative we actually think of him. But I think if we just take it like a step higher, I think this blend of influences is extremely evident in his later life and political career, because it armed him with the understanding of the agrarian military issues coming largely from his father's side, but his strategic thinking, appreciation for education, and bureaucratic skills were almost entirely influenced by his mom's background. And I think this unique combination of traits and experiences helped shape him into the very skilled diplomat and strategist he would become. And, ultimately in his role in unifying Germany and navigating what we know as a very, very complex political landscape of 19th century Europe.
Yeah, for sure. It's this, again, that mix, and you have to be at the right place at the right time. And there's this opportunity that's kind of poking its head out saying there's the possibility of some sort of unification here, but we're going to just have to find a way to make it work. And I think it's, again, we wouldn't be talking about him if he was born maybe 100 years earlier. He probably would have been very successful in whatever he did.
100%.
But again, the circumstances are right, I think, at this point. And yeah, I'm very curious to kind of see how he goes from, was it inevitable? I think is part of it is
always.
We always look at this, right? Of course he had a great upbringing and he did all of these great things, but it seems like the hand he's dealt is quite strong, and you're going to need someone like that who's got a strong hand, but also who can take advantage of it, plus with the circumstances to accomplish what he accomplishes.
You nailed it. And I think, maybe to throw a bit of a wrench into this whole idea of inevitability. So, education is always something that we talk about here because obviously it can be very deterministic in terms of, career choices and aspirations that some of the leaders kind of fall into. In terms of his education, it seems quite typical of Prussian nobility. His mom recognized his potential and pushed for a very high quality education. So in 1832, he enrolls in university to study law, but he doesn't really enjoy it. He's much more interested in social life than on university or any academic pursuits. He's known for his very boisterous behavior, heavy drinking, and dueling, which is a common practice among noblemen at the time. After a short stint there, he actually transfers to the University of Berlin. Again, not so focused on his studies, and he kind of gains a reputation for his lively and often reckless social life. Despite all this, he still manages to complete his degree. Following his education, so he enters the civil service for a little bit, partly kind of fulfilling his family's expectations. It doesn't really seem like he's all too interested in these positions. They seem extremely bureaucratic, and he actually resigns from his post in 1839. He returns home to manage his family's estates in Pomerania after his mom's death. And I think a lot of historians seem to think that this period away from the political scene was pretty significant in shaping his character, because he had to engage in many of like the traditional day-to-day duties of managing his estate. And, you know, this experience, I would imagine, grounded him in the realities of like land management and rural life, which were key aspects of that traditional life that his father kind of came from.
It's a bit of this entrepreneurial kind of lifestyle where, you know, you're not showing up to work and saying, here's what you need to do. You're setting the scene on what needs to be done. And if you don't get it done, it probably won't get done. So you have this heightened level of responsibility, but then it's less predictable. You're having to, you know, juggle all of these things. And as you were talking, I was just thinking of kind of some parallels to Harry Truman, where Truman kind of is lost in life, has his military career, tries to run a bunch of businesses. It doesn't really work out, but then he goes into the civil service. And after the time where he's failed and tried and failed at a whole bunch of different things, he's able to be very successful. And you can see a lot of those skills that he's built up over those years being quite relevant to the work that he's doing. And I see a bit of a parallel here where Bismarck's coming back to, like you said, he's running this estate. And I can see why historians are saying this is such a transformative time for him, because it's a big change in environment and maybe a bit of a reset, but also a necessity to learn all of these new skills that he's going to need for the future.
Yeah, I think that's a very apt kind of analysis, because it seems like this is a period of like extreme personal growth for him. He becomes much more serious and focused. He sheds some of the recklessness that characterizes his youth. In 1847, he gets married. So this union kind of marks a significant turning point in his personal life. His wife, Johanna, has a very strong Lutheran faith and conservative values, which ultimately influenced Bismarck quite greatly. And it kind of led to him deepening his own religious faith and conservative beliefs. And I think this is probably where we can kind of shift into the makings of what would ultimately become him as a Iron Chancellor, as what we I'm sure, I don't know if anyone called him that at the time, but this is definitely how we refer to him now. And essentially, you know, what I found out was this nickname wasn't just a testament to his political toughness, but also relates to an incident where he was reported to have worn an iron helmet during a military campaign. And it kind of created this kind of folklore around this image of Bismarck in his Pickelhaube, which is a spiked helmet, which is, you know, for our Prussian historians out there, a symbol of Prussian military power. And it kind of became iconic.
It's interesting. I've always wondered where that's come from. When we were doing the Wilhelm episode, every picture of him in military equipment or a military uniform, he always had the spiked helmet on. So it's very interesting to see where that comes from, because I always wondered, like, hey, why is there a spike on the helmet? But it clearly represented something important to you know, that Prussian side of the German people.
I guess if all else fails, you can just throw your helmet at the enemy and hopefully you hit somebody.
Yeah, if you lose your knife, you can always headbutt.
Essentially, so this is where his kind of political career takes off. So he becomes minister president of Prussia from 1862 to 1871, when King Wilhelm I appoints him. You know, this is essentially seen as a temporary appointment to manage a constitutional crisis over military reform. However, this is where we start to see the makings of a very, very talented strategic leader, because he's quickly able to demonstrate his skills as a master strategist and diplomat. So early on, I guess the way he was able to kind of maneuver into the minister president role, and for anyone who's thinking, what is a minister president? This is essentially the head of state for Prussia. So you're talking about these loosely aligned kind of regions and territories in a pre-unified German empire, which will be the German Empire. He is essentially, you know, kind of given the role temporarily of minister president of Prussia. But his political journey starts in 1847, where he is a member of the Prussian United Diet in 1847. He represents the conservative younger class. He's staunchly defending monarchical and aristocratic principles, especially during the 1848 revolutions, which saw a wave of liberal and nationalistic uprisings across Europe. His position to these movements and his unwavering support for the monarchy start to earn him some recognition. Bismarck's early political stance caught the attention of King Frederick William V, who appointed him to various diplomatic posts, starting with the Prussian legation to the German Confederation in Frankfurt. His time as a diplomat in Frankfurt and St. Petersburg and Paris was crucial in developing his skills in international politics and diplomacy, and it also helped him build a very extensive network of contacts and gain a deep understanding of European affairs, which, I think was obviously pivotal for the alliance system that he kind of orchestrated and was the architect of.
Yeah, you definitely see at this time period, a lot of what's said in the court or what's said in the open is not what's actually going on. There's this piece of you have to be seen as, this king who's being shown all this respect, and, you can never question, and a lot of those sort of things, especially when you look at, going to see the Tsar in Russia or something like that. But where a lot of these diplomatic dealings are done are kind of in the back rooms, away from the fanfare. And so for Bismarck to get himself into that ring, understand how this is done, but also, like you were saying, to develop this list of contacts, I think is huge for him, because he can not call up, but send a letter to someone and say, hey, I need to talk to the emperor, maybe a little bit more hush hush, or I need to go through some back channels. Kind of keep it away, because if you're the Tsar of Russia, you have to seem strong and you have to seem like what you're doing. You can't concede anything to anybody, even if it's for diplomatic purposes. Yep. Where if you can kind of go through the back door and say, we're gonna come out and we're gonna say this, but what we really mean is this. I think it's such a huge part for him, and it's going to be essential as he's trying to unify this country, to be able to work through those channels without having to just go to the front door and ask very nicely every time.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's essentially how he's able to kind of maneuver and leverage his opportunities so effectively. So leading up throughout this kind of journey, for years of kind of getting involved and getting his feet wet in diplomacy and international relations, when he is appointed minister president in 1862, there's a growing conflict between the monarchy and the liberally elected parliament over military reforms. And this is where King Wilhelm, really needs to strengthen the army, but the parliament is demanding more liberal reforms and a constitutional government, which are refusing the right to authorize that necessary budget to kind of have that military expansion. And that's where Bismarck gets his opportunity to become minister president. Again, he's seen as a temporary appointment and someone who could manage the crisis and enforce the king's will. And upon his appointment, this is pretty awesome, Bismarck famously argued that the great issues of the day would be decided not through speeches and majority decisions, but by iron and blood. This is often paraphrased as blood and iron, or his policy of blood and iron. And I think this statement really reflects his belief in the primacy of state power and military strength over parliamentary debate and democracy. And I think this really gets at the heart of his decision-making and strategic prowess.
Yeah, he's almost like he's trying to find this fine balance between almost like autocratic power versus some sort of democracy, because I see a little bit of Socrates in him, where he doesn't fully trust democracy because he doesn't trust that the people are able to make the best decisions, where you need this kind of hardened, highly educated military person to kind of hammer in those ideas and make it work, and not have to go through all these hoops and ladders that democracy throws at you. So it's one of these things where just someone like Bismarck, or somebody who's very capable, it can work very, very effectively. But then when you get someone, Kaiser Wilhelm, or any of these other leaders that come across who really aren't as powerful, or aren't as strong, but have this ridiculous amount of power,
exactly,
it kind of all blows up. So I find it interesting to see there's definitely a lot of confidence that he has, because when he makes this speech, I'm sure he's not saying, blood and iron and this really strong, hardened leader, whoever it might be. I'm sure he's thinking in the back of his head of, I'm going to be this person, or I'm going to have a key role in all of this, because he's got his ideas and he seems to be kind of pushing that agenda.
It totally makes sense, because what ultimately happens is that he bypasses the parliament. He effectively bypassed the parliament in funding military reforms. He argued that the government could collect taxes and reform the military without parliamentary consent. This move, obviously legally dubious, but it did demonstrate his determination to strengthen the Prussian state and the army. And essentially it laid the groundwork for his later achievements in unifying Germany. Germany. And in parallel, he's also able to consolidate power. So once he is in the role of minister president, he begins this consolidation. So again, he skillfully navigates this very complex political landscape of Prussia. He balances the demands of the king, the military, the conservative factions, while neutralizing his liberal and nationalistic opponents.
I think it's quite telling that he's able to do something like this. Like, sure, going past parliament and not following the rule of law is always a little bit dubious, but it's not like he's just going to get away scot-free all the time. He still needs to make those political dealings and make sure that every stakeholder is happy or not angry at this decision, because again, if one or two of those factions decide, hey, this guy is becoming too much of a tyrant, let's try to overthrow him, it's done before he even gets a chance to get started. So I think sometimes when we hear, someone went past parliament or they kind of bended the rules a little bit, I'm putting myself in this box, sometimes we jump to, they just did it because they didn't care and they just wanted what they wanted. He's going through all of that process and he's making sure that he's making the move at the right time and making sure that he's not going to ruffle too many feathers when he does it. I'm sure he's ruffling some feathers and some people are calling him a tyrant and all these sort of things. But as long as he's got, if 3 voices are yelling at him, but he's got 10 behind him, supporting him, that's all he really needs. And again, he's going around the democratic process. But if you've got more people on your side, it's kind of this like pseudo democracy that he's kind of put together. I'm sure it's not traditional democracy in the sense of people voting, but of that aristocracy and nobility. If you can control that, you're essentially going to be able to do what you need to do.
Yeah, I think, it just really speaks to his intelligence and the ability to... It's funny, while you were speaking, I felt like if we clipped like 30 seconds of what you said, that could apply to like most people's jobs day in and day out.
Yep. Very true.
We continue on from his kind of consolidation of power as the minister president, and I want to jump to kind of his role in the actual unification of Germany. So this is a cornerstone of his legacy, and this is what most people know him for, as this great kind of German unifier. And again, I think this showcases his strategic brilliance and diplomatic skills, and also some of his personality. And there's a couple interesting stories here that I think really speaks to how far he was willing to go in his meeting of his vision for a unified Germany. So I guess the unification process under his leadership is kind of marked by 3 major conflicts. You have the Danish War, the Austro-Prussian War, and the Franco-Prussian War. And these wars, combined with some diplomatic maneuvers, effectively led to the consolidation of German states into the single empire under, Prussian dominance. So you have the Danish War, which happens in 1864, the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, which had sizable German-speaking populations under Danish rule. Their question of governance has long been contentious issues in European politics. Bismarck forms an alliance with Austria to confront Denmark over the status of these duchies, and his motive was to increase Prussian influence in the German Confederation and to create a pretext for conflict with Austria. This war is brief and it ends in a decisive victory for the Prussian-Austrian alliance. The Treaty of Vienna, 1864, results in the administration of Schleswig and Holstein being divided between Prussia and Austria, setting the next stage for Bismarck's plan. So you can see the first domino essentially falls here.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, right? As Prussian leader, skill and victory on the battlefield is going to score you a lot of points with a lot of people. Sure. And to now have this behind him is, saying, hey, we went to war against a historically very powerful empire and, kicked their butts on the battlefield and won decisively. That's going to get him a lot of points, I think, across the entire country. So yeah, you really can see those dominoes falling into place, and it's one that absolutely has to fall in some capacity.
Exactly.
And he gets it out of the way early. And now he can always point back to that saying, I have this military tradition. I've won us glory on the battlefield. You have to trust me to start doing, part B, part C, part D, and all the way to eventually his ultimate goal.
Yeah. And it's amazing. So the follow-up or the next domino is the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, also known as the 7 Weeks War. So at this point, the administration of Schleswig and Holstein becomes a point of major contention tension between Prussia and Austria. And Bismarck's hoping to exclude Austria from German affairs to achieve, again, Prussian dominance. So his strategy, he carefully isolates Austria diplomatically. He secured the neutrality of other major powers like France and Russia and the modernized Prussian army. The war essentially ends very, very quickly. It's a decisive Prussian victory. Peace of Prague effectively dissolved the German Confederation and established the North German Confederation under Prussian leadership, excluding Austria, which again was a critical step towards German unification, and it brought many northern German states under Prussian control. So essentially now the second domino has toppled.
Yeah, it's like 1,000 cuts here, right? It's slowly
Yep.
you're starting to see, okay, these people are, on the side of the Prussians, and, the Austrians have less influence and the Russians aren't going to get involved. So maybe this is something that can happen, and it's slowly coming along. And you're right, it really is just a lot of dominoes that need to fall before this can all come together. But yeah, it's starting to slowly move in that direction.
And before the third and final domino topples, there's actually an assassination attempt on Bismarck's life in 1866 preceding the 7 Weeks' War. And this story is fascinating, and I think it really adds to the whole mystique of the Iron Chancellor. So it's on May 7th, 1866, Otto von Bismarck confronted in Berlin by a 22-year-old student named Ferdinand Cohen-Blind, who attempted to murder the minister-president and halt the path to war that the Prussian state was already now set on, and the wheels were in motion. So Cohen-Blind essentially checks into a hotel on May 5th. 2 days later, he spots the first minister returning home on foot after meeting King Wilhelm at the Berlin Palace. He approaches Bismarck from behind, and without waiting for him to turn around, he fires 2 shots with a revolver. Hearing the sound of the gun, Bismarck turned and grabbed the young student, who then fired 3 more shots. Luckily for Bismarck, soldiers of the 1st Battalion and 2nd Guards Regiment were there at the moment marching, and they essentially were able to kind of come in and arrest Cohen-Blind. But rather than seek medical attention, Bismarck decides to continue home. He walks home, greets his wife with a few unrelated jokes. He then heads to his study, returning to regale Johanna with the story of what just happened. Later that evening, the king's personal physician arrives, and he finds that the first 3 bullets had only grazed his body, while the last 2 had actually ricocheted off his ribs, but had caused no significant injuries.
I don't even know what to say, but again, my first thought was, well, we always say we know they're built differently back then, but to take 5 bullets and then go home and have dinner like nothing happened, you really are built differently.
Yep.
But I just love the story of, they ricocheted off his ribs and he was able to just keep going along. I'm sure there's the propaganda machine working there, but
100%
also
there is. Yes. Yeah.
But also at the same time, it just adds to the folklore of what Bismarck is as this strong Prussian. We said it a million times. He's such a strong leader that he can get shot 5 times and that's not even going to take him down. So it's like
he can walk home and go tell his wife the story and then wait a couple hours to see the king's doctor.
Yeah. It's like, honey, you never believe what happened. I was shot 5 times. Oh, you okay? Yeah, I'm great. What's for dinner? I'm going to go read for a little bit and do some correspondence. Like it's just so many things that kind of work towards his favor when it comes to, if there are, another assassination attempt is plotted, what are they going to do? We're going to need a cannon to take this guy out. How are we going to get a cannon there? Because we know we can't, his ribs are bulletproof. Like, it's like, how people would think back then too, right? There's people are not fully understanding what's going on and can only read between the lines so much. So
100%. Yeah.
This is only going to work in his favor, but yeah, what a story though. 5 bullets and he just marches on.
I had to share that when I came across it. And
it's
I think, again, it just speaks to his mystique and kind of folklore surrounding him. And I think that kind of sets the stage for the final and last domino to fall, which is the Franco-Prussian War, which happens in 1870 and 1871. So essentially, to unify the southern German states with the northern German Confederation, Bismarck needed to create an external threat that would rally these states to Prussia's side. His strategy? He masterfully manipulated diplomatic relations, culminating in what's called the Ems Dispatch, which he edited to provoke France into declaring war on Prussia. So a little bit of background on this. So this is probably one of his most famous diplomatic maneuvers. So he edited a telegram sent by King Wilhelm I to make it appear that the French ambassador had been insulted. Bismarck incited French public opinion and essentially provoked them into declaring war on Prussia. This clever manipulation was essentially instrumental in starting the Franco-Prussian War, which led to the final domino toppling, which was that the southern German states, as he predicted, joined forces with Prussia against France. The war culminated in a decisive German victory and the Siege of Paris. It ended with the Treaty of Frankfurt in 1871 and formally ended the war, granting territory to the new German Empire.
It's funny because as you were saying that story, I was just remembering what we talked about last time, where this really is, Europe is still like a family that's just fighting. The fact that war gets created because an ambassador was insulted, and you can't stand for that. We need to put our men in harm's way, spend a lot of money to go to war. I think is, again, just sums up that time so perfectly.
Yeah, and we have Twitter today, so it's kind of terrifying, right?
Yeah.
So, sorry, X. But yeah, it just goes to show you how far we've come, maybe, sometimes.
But what a move, though, by Bismarck here. Again, he's doing things that are quite, it's treason by any other, whatever way you want to look at it. But he's clever. He gets away with it, and it works out. He makes a lot of gambles, and it works. And again, he's too smart of a guy to not understand like what he's doing. It seems like he had, there's big dominoes that are falling. There's a bunch of mini dominoes that he needs to fall as well. And in this case, right, he knows what he's doing. He's probably covering his tracks so he doesn't get caught. And even if he did get caught, I'm sure he had a whole plan for that too. And it just, I would love to have seen his thought process on a lot of these things. And we've talked about it with other leaders where they understand how each decision is going to impact not just them, but everybody around them. And we talked about this with Napoleon, right? On the battlefield, he would know if I send troops over here, that's going to cause these guys to retreat, but these guys are going to be weak. So the whole line's going to shift. And he was able to think, he's playing like 340 chess. You're moving along. And
Yeah.
Bismarck kind of seems like the political kind of statecrafty kind of guy from that perspective, where he's able to see, okay, if I edit this telegram, it's going to cause France to declare war, but then I also need to get the French people on board so they can put pressure on their government. But then I also have to start sending out feelers to the southern German states, right? Yeah. And then it just all kind of comes together, and it's quite clever what he does. But again, it's one of those things where a lot can go wrong, but I think what we see with him is there's a lot of patience and there's a lot of thinking and waiting for the right moment to do things. He's not just jumping at the first opportunity that he sees.
100%. And I think, so like what I came across, and it's a term I haven't heard since like my undergrad, which was that like his approach to unification is best characterized by this idea of like realpolitik, which is essentially defined as a pragmatic and strategic use of power and diplomacy, often with little regard for ethical or ideological considerations.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
It nails it, right? Like that's how I see it.
Machiavelli must have loved him, right? This is exactly what Machiavelli would told you to do. Find a way to make it work. Yep. If you got to kill some people to do it, if you've got to stab people in the back, but it's going to help you, do it. What do you care, right? The thing is, someone else is plotting to do the exact same thing, and you sometimes have to be first to it. But I think this time too kind of almost calls for a little bit of that, right? There's no stability, so something's going to happen at some point, and it's going to be kickstarted in whatever way it might happen. And I think a lot of these leaders are thinking, well, if something's going to kick off, it's going to be on my terms, on the way I want it. And we think about that from a general's perspective. They want to pick the area that they're going to fight, and they want to fight on their terms. Yep. They don't want to get caught on their heels by another opposing army. I think Bismarck, again, kind of drawing that general comparison, he's able to say, yep, well, it needs to have some sort of unification here, and I'm going to be the one to kind of kickstart all of this, or there's going to need to be another war between us and France at some point. Just there's too much tension. I'm going to find a way to kick it off and make sure that we're prepared and that I can get something out of it, which is German unification. So I think it is quite brilliant that he's able to juggle all of those things and really kind of think like a general would in that same sense, but from a more strategic perspective and over a longer time horizon.
It's quite incredible, right? Like he is a very patient, pragmatic, and strategic guy. And I didn't know this about like the actual unification of Germany. It's actually a great question. Like what actually happens once you've unified, is there a party? Like, is there a proclamation? So there actually was. It's quite a historic moment in 1871, the proclamation of the German Empire. It actually happens in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. I didn't know this. On January 18th, 1871, where Wilhelm I of Prussia was declared the German emperor. And this act not just symbolized the unification of Germany, but it also shifts the balance of power in Europe. It marks the end of the old German Confederation and the rise of the German Empire as a major European power.
Versailles, interesting. It's very interesting for those who are kind of questioning the same thing we are, that, World War I, you have the Treaty of Versailles, which brings the most shame that Germany would ever feel to that point. It's just kind of interesting. You can see like we're celebrating the creation of this brand new state, which is also funny too, because didn't they just go to war with France? So again, this time period is just bizarre on so many levels, how you can be at each other's throats to celebrating the birth of a new, more powerful nation that just defeated you on the battlefield. So that I will never understand, but welcome to mid to late 1800s Europe, I guess.
It's a fascinating place. And I think, typically this is kind of where we bookend the Iron Chancellor. I know we're, creeping up on that hour mark, but I just want to touch on a couple of more things that I think are actually quite interesting. One thing that I came across that he continued to do once unification has been proclaimed unanimously, now it's about strengthening and centralizing power and consolidating this kind of national sentiment. So it's this idea of culture comp, an attempt to reduce the influence of the Roman Catholic Church in Germany. So, he obviously is a religious man. His wife's a devout Lutheran, but Bismarck is driven by a strategic imperative to unify and stabilize the German Empire. And he saw the influence of the Roman Catholic Church as a potential threat to state sovereignty, particularly due to its allegiance to an external authority, the Pope. So through culture conf with measures like the May Laws, Bismarck aimed to assert state supremacy over the church, hoping to align its activities more closely to the state's interests rather than suppress the Catholic faith overall, which again is a very strategic maneuver, very outside of the realm of what we would consider a intelligent maneuver at this point. But again, he's able, or he's at least attempting to do it in this very nuanced and balanced way.
I think it's brilliant in the sense that he's recognizing this changing world. And we chatted about this earlier about, we look at someone like Queen Isabella, who was able to unify Spain 350 years earlier, and Catholicism was that unifying factor. And it worked quite well for her because she was able to unify Spain under Catholicism. And really just, if you weren't Catholic, you don't have a place in that country. Where Bismarck is coming along, and he could have gone down the old trope of we're going to unify under one religion. We're going to be, if it's whatever, Lutheran or whatever form of Christianity they want. But the history of Lutheranism also too is breaking away from the Roman Catholic kind of control of Rome and the Pope. And so I think he's starting to see a little bit of this appetite coming through the German people, where they're religious. They find it to be a source of pride and everything that a lot of religious people feel in maybe a more modern sense. But we look at even what's happening with England and them breaking away and the church having less and less power. He sees this changing world and he's able to adapt to it. And he understands too that, like you said, the external threat of the Pope is always going to be a powerful one, no matter who you are. So to be able to make those kind of changes, I think is really, really key. And not being able to just fall on what's worked in the past and really kind of see what this maybe more, I wouldn't say progressive, but just a change is really happening, I guess is the best way to say it. A change in how people look at religion from a state perspective versus, what may have happened in the past. This is a bit of a change, and he's able to jump on it and kind of catapult it to kind of keeping this nation together under what we had chatted about earlier, under what would be considered more traditional nationalism, where being German is the most important thing, not being Catholic or being Protestant or whatever, some other countries might have been doing, 100, 200 years earlier.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one of the things that I kind of take away from that is his ability to adapt and his adaptability overall. So we're talking about this kind of stark contrast in comparison to how we typically see leaders in this time or leaders that predate him. It's kind of a progressive move. And, we talked earlier about industrialization. This is one of the last points I'll make before we kind of tie it off with him, is that there's rising industrialization. There's a growth of socialism right now. And Bismarck is a staunch conservative, and he viewed the growing strength of the socialist movement as a threat to the stability and unity of the German Empire. Yet, and I think this really speaks to how pragmatic he is, he implements a series of social reform that are quite aspirational. He institutes health insurance in 1883, the Health Insurance Act, which in certain industries now mandates that employers provide sick pay and medical care, which was financed through a combination of worker and employer contributions. Accident insurance in 1884, disability and old age insurance in 1889. Obviously, he was trying to counter socialism, so I think it's worthwhile to kind of double down on that. It didn't necessarily stop the growth of socialism, but you could see again he's willing to take the necessary steps to curb or stop something that he sees as a threat to this kind of broader unification and nationalistic sentiment that he thinks is going to be required and foundational to keep a strong, unified Germany.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there, because he's getting ahead of something that he sees is coming.
Exactly.
And so he could sit back and, cross his arms and say, nope, I'm a conservative guy and it's a free for all and everybody has to kind of stand up for themselves. But he's looking what's going on around the world with revolutions happening, especially around workers' rights are starting, but also just the peasant populations rising up and saying, we've had enough of the king and these noble classes having all of the power, where it looks like Bismarck is, he's still in that camp where the nobility is going to have a lot of the power and, a certain group of individuals, but he understands that this is essentially a way of keeping the masses under control and making sure that the stability of this new nation is strong, because we take it for granted where, they sign the piece of paper and say, hey, we're unified and everybody claps their hands and has a party. But tomorrow, what's to stop one of the states going, what, we got cold feet. We don't like how we're being treated in this, to threaten to break away or to threaten to, join another empire or something like that. So for him, I think stability is the name of the game. And this is a great move to start pushing Germany in the sense of people feel like they're getting a little bit every time. They're getting something and they're not just being oppressed. And they're like, hey, this new German empire and this Bismarck guy, hey, they're doing some really great things. But it's not to the point where it's opening everything up to a world where, socialism could take over the government or have really a strong foothold in the country. He's trying to find maybe that happy medium where he can stay kind of keep his conservatism and that type of way of governing in power, but also make some concessions where he needs to.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. He is quite incredible at kind of seeing the writing on the wall and getting ahead of it. And I think just to kind of tie this off before we get into some of just some free discussion about his leadership and decision making. So as you know, with the Wilhelm episode, Bismarck's dismissed in 1890 by Emperor Wilhelm II, which essentially marks the end of a amazing, super important political career in the eyes of Wilhelm. He had become too independent and powerful, and his cautious, pragmatic, patient foreign policy was at odds with Wilhelm's more aggressive stance. After he's dismissed, Bismarck spent his final years writing his memoirs and criticizing the new direction of German policy.
It's very on brand for him. Like, I think from what I've read too, like, he's not someone who you would look at and say, Bismarck, do you got anything to say? And he'd be like, no, I think I'm good. He's got something to say. He's got something to say, right? And to write those memoirs, and we gave a few quotes last week about how he was not a fan of Wilhelm even from a young age.
No.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of the natural ebbs and flows of politics, right? Where things are peaceful, things are going well, but some people see going to war as an opportunity to enhance whatever they're trying to enhance. And unfortunately for Bismarck, his time had come and it was time to move on. But, talk about a legacy, right? Like, you literally created a nation that still exists today. It's one of the most powerful countries in the world. It goes on to have some of the highest of highs and the lowest of lows as a nation. Yeah. So yeah, it's an interesting end to his life, and it does suck that he wasn't able to at least hang around a little bit longer and maybe would have had more of an influence into stopping World War I from happening, or at least setting the seeds for a more diplomatic solution to that. But that's the way life takes, and I'm glad he kept speaking his mind or writing his mind so we can look back on his life and we know what he was thinking up to the day he died. Yeah,
I think he's a fascinating historical figure, and I'm glad we decided to do an episode on him because I've learned quite a lot. And I think from my perspective, at least in terms of what I'm taking away from his leadership and decision making, he is kind of like a master class in realpolitik. Pragmatic, patient. He believes in strong centralized control. Yeah, there's some authoritarianism kind of thrown in there, but it's a mark of the times. And he has a remarkable ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining a steadfast commitment to his overarching goal. He never loses sight of his vision, which is a unified Germany, and he's willing to pivot, adapt to get there. And I think you can see that in his decision making because he has a very acute understanding of power dynamics, a very pragmatic approach to governance, and this like almost miraculous keen sense of timing, which I don't know how you can do, but he seemed to have mastered it.
Yeah, I think you've got all the major points there. And I like what you said of that goal was clearly in his mind of, I need to unify this country. And I could see as we talked, like there was definitely times where he could have fallen into the trap of being more ideological and he didn't. And
No.
he may have been, more conservative than some people would have liked and more liberal maybe than some people would have liked. But at the end, he was able to create a country that is still together today, despite losing 2 massive wars. I think goes to show he didn't just, work the political game. He also helps to build a culture at the right time. And to your point on timing, I think it's just at some point you just get really, really good at reading a room and you have a really good group of people around him. And again, that's the thing we never really know enough about is, the second in command, the third in command, the guy he goes to when there's an agriculture issue. He probably had one of the smartest people or smartest groups of people that he could go talk to on specific issues to give him really good advice, right? We never really, I think, talk about it enough because we don't know who these people are. But we look at, again, we're going to go back to Wilhelm just because it's such an easy comparison. He's putting yes men, friends, family members, people who are going to tell him what he wants to hear and make things easy. I have a feeling that Bismarck's putting people around him who are definitely on the same page as him, definitely going to respect him and treat him as the leader that he is. But when stuff's going wrong, they're going to come to him and say, hey, we got a problem. Here's a bunch of solutions. Let's figure something out. And I think that's a theme that we've seen a million times when we talk to these leaders. But, we can only speculate, but there's no way he is able to accomplish what he does without having an incredible network of not only diplomatic relationships around the world, but even within his own domestic world, there's got to be a lot of talent that he's got around him. And I think that's, when we look at like modern people in the business world, like building a great team and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
No leader is great without a great team. And I think I would be very curious to see kind of what he had around him and, what he would use to kind of assemble those teams.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. It's such a great point. It's something that we don't really get into because I think we turned an hour-long episode into a 3-hour-long episode. But yeah, I think you can't be short-sighted in that analysis. Obviously, he had every intellectual faculty to do what he did and do it very well, to have the lasting legacy of a unified Germany. But I think there is absolutely no way he could have done this without being surrounded by the right people.
100%. Yeah, I think that's kind of a good way to wrap it up. There's a lot of takeaways we can take from Bismarck, and we're going to be making a lot more comparisons to him and to some of these other nation builders as we move on with future episodes.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks everyone. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.